All right, buckle up for this deep dive
Oh, yeah.
because we are heading straight into the underbelly of the British prison system with a man named Ray Hill. You wanted to understand the life of a career criminal.
Yeah,
Well, Ray spent nearly 30 years navigating that world, and he held absolutely nothing back in this interview.
he really didn't.
It's raw.
It's intense, and he paints a picture of prison life in the 70s and 80s. Honestly, it'll probably stay with you.
Yeah.
But to really grasp how someone becomes so ingrained in that life, we need to rewind all the way back to the beginning.
Okay, let's unpack this. Take us back to Ray's childhood.
He grew up in Acton, a district in West London, and it wasn't an easy start. Poverty was a constant companion. But the truly harrowing detail is the abuse that he suffered as a young child. Imagine being sent away at 5 or 6 years old, hoping for sanctuary, only to find more of the same horror in a children's home in Wales.
It's heartbreaking, and honestly, it makes you question how anyone could come out of that unscathed. How does that kind of trauma, especially at such a young age, factor into someone's life trajectory?
It's like a wound that never quite heals. This kind of early trauma can lead to deep-seated anger, a fundamental distrust of others, and a real struggle to form healthy, stable relationships. It doesn't excuse criminal behavior, but it is crucial context.
Right, we're talking about understanding the roots, not justifying the action. So how did Ray first encounter the law?
His first brush with the justice system was as a young teenager, dabbling in petty theft. By 15, he found himself in Borstal. Think of it like a youth prison. But instead of rehabilitation, it was more like an introduction to the harsh realities of prison life.
He actually describes witnessing a brutal attack where a boy was slashed with razor blades embedded in toothbrushes. I mean, that's the stuff of nightmares.
That's exactly what criminologists call the school of crime effect. Instead of acting as a deterrent, these institutions, often overcrowded and lacking resources for rehabilitation, became breeding grounds for hardened criminals. Young offenders like Ray were exposed to a level of violence and criminal mentality that only solidified their path.
It's tragic, almost like the system backfired, pushing him further down the path it was meant to correct. So Borstal obviously didn't set him straight. Where does he go from there?
He ended up back in London and lands a job at Brentford Market, a bustling hub that, according to Ray, was riddled with criminal activity.
Markets, especially in struggling areas, often become fertile ground for that sort of thing, don't they? Lots of cash, merchandise, that sense of anonymity in the crowd.
Precisely. And for Ray, Brentford Market became his entry into a darker world. He talks about this guy, Colin Kell, a boxer with ties to the market's underbelly, who becomes a sort of volatile mentor figure in Ray's life.
It's that classic push and pull, isn't it? The allure of a mentor, the danger of someone entrenched in that life.
Absolutely. Colin showed Ray the ropes, both in terms of the criminal enterprises happening at the market and the brutal realities of that world. Their relationship was a whirlwind of loyalty and betrayal, a common thread in Ray's story, as you'll see.
So how does this mentorship, if you can call it that, impact Ray's trajectory? Does he go deeper into this criminal underworld?
He does. Ray even gets involved in a planned heist with a group from the market, targeting a man rumored to have a stash of gold. But like many of Ray's ventures, it ends in disaster.
Oh, what happened?
The heist quickly unravels, and in the ensuing chaos, Ray is arrested. He insists that he never hit a police officer at the scene, but his accomplice, Martin, throws him under the bus, claiming Ray was the one who attacked the officer.
Wow, that's cold. And that betrayal landed him an 18-year sentence.
That's right. While he had been inside Borstal, this sentence throws him headfirst into the brutal world of adult prisons, starting with Wormwood Scrubs.
I've heard stories about Wormwood Scrubs. It has a pretty grim reputation, even among prisons.
It's practically infamous. And in the 70s and 80s, when Ray was there, it was notorious for its harsh conditions. He describes rampant violence, this constant sense of threat, and a rigid power structure among inmates that dictated every aspect of life within those walls.
To make matters worse, he even crossed paths with the Kray twins while at Wormwood Scrubs. It's almost surreal, like something out of a gangster film.
It goes to show just how ingrained violence was in the very fabric of these prisons. The Krays, notorious London gangsters, held significant sway both inside and outside prison walls. Their presence was a constant reminder of the lawlessness that permeated even the most secure facilities. But their presence wasn't the only darkness lurking within those walls.
You're saying there were things even more disturbing than encountering the Krays.
Ray witnessed acts of unimaginable cruelty between inmates. One incident in particular is particularly difficult to hear.
What happened?
2 Sri Lankan prisoners brutally assaulted a young girl, even infecting her with a sexually transmitted disease.
Oh my God, that's horrific.
It is. And tragically, Ray, still a teenager himself at this point, was recruited to help mete out their punishment.
Wait, he was forced to participate in the violence?
That's the thing. It wasn't presented as a choice. It highlights how easily the lines between victim and perpetrator blurred within those walls. Here was Ray, someone who had suffered horrific abuse, now caught up in this brutal system that demanded he inflict the same on others.
It's a vicious cycle, and it makes you think about the psychological impact. But you mentioned earlier that it wasn't all darkness and violence. What did you mean by that?
It's true. As grim as Ray's story gets, and believe me, it gets grimmer, there are these glimmers of humanity. Even in the most desolate places, people find ways to connect, to forge bonds.
It's strange to think about glimmers of humanity existing in a place like that. What form did these connections take?
Sometimes it was about mentorship, like with a man named Peter Kelly. He took Ray under his wing and taught him the often unspoken rules of prison life. In a place like that, knowing the rules, even the unwritten ones, could be the difference between survival and becoming a target.
It's like a twisted social ecosystem with its own hierarchy and codes of conduct.
Exactly. And then there were those moments of camaraderie that emerged from the shared experience of confinement. One of the more, let's say, colorful anecdotes Ray shares involves a rather unique tradition.
Okay, this I've got to hear.
They call them parcels. Imagine this. Inmates, due to limited access to toilets and a desperate need for privacy, would defecate on newspapers, wrap them up, and toss them out the cell windows.
You're kidding. Parcels. That's both disgusting and strangely ingenious.
Right. It highlights the lengths they would go to in those conditions.
Yeah.
But it also speaks to that dark humor, that shared defiance that helped them cope.
It's these kinds of details that truly give you a feel for what life was like on the inside. But back to those darker moments you mentioned, Ray also crossed paths with some notorious figures, didn't he?
He did. He recounts encountering Graham Young, the infamous poisoner. He describes him as an unassuming man, quietly occupying the cell next to his. However, Ray kept hearing this incessant clicking noise coming from Young's cell each night.
It's funny, in a macabre kind of way, because when I hear clicking sound in prison, I think of someone meticulously filing away at their bars trying to escape.
Well, in a strange twist, the clicking was coming from a typewriter. Graham Young, a convicted murderer, was allowed a typewriter in his cell to write his life story.
Wow, I can't imagine that happening today. It speaks volumes about the different attitudes towards rehabilitation or perhaps even morbid fascination with notorious criminals back then.
Precisely. And Ray's reaction is interesting. He was less concerned with Young's writing and more focused on getting his tobacco back. The guards had confiscated it because, poison.
Right, wouldn't want to give a convicted poisoner easy access to more tools of the trade, I suppose.
Exactly. But this brings us to a turning point in Ray's journey. Albany Prison and a fateful encounter with an inmate they called Tank.
Okay, that nickname alone doesn't sound promising. What went down at Albany?
It started with something as seemingly trivial as a disagreement over leftover breakfast eggs in the prison kitchen. But this minor spat escalated dramatically, plunging Ray into the darkest chapter of his imprisonment.
It's amazing how quickly things could go south in those environments. Something as simple as eggs could ignite a powder keg.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Tank was not someone to trifle with. He was a force in the prison hierarchy. The confrontation over the eggs was just the spark. What followed was a terrifying display of escalating violence.
What will happen?
Ray was jumped by Tank and his crew. Later, they attacked him in his cell. He was stabbed, but he managed to fight back, which unfortunately only fueled the fire. It all culminated in a brutal showdown between Ray and Tank.
It's hard to imagine the level of desperation that would lead to such a confrontation.
Survival often trumps reason in those circumstances. Ray, thankfully, lived to tell the tale. He describes grabbing a heavy block of wood during the fight and bringing it down on Tank's head, splitting it open.
It's a grim victory, though, isn't it?
It was. While it momentarily subdued Tank, it cemented Ray's status as a problem, someone who needed to be brought down a peg or two, or 10. And the methods they used were straight out of a nightmare.
This is where the story takes an even darker turn, right? I've heard about the brutal tactics used in those days to break prisoners.
You're right. Ray described being forcibly injected with powerful sedatives, beaten unconscious, and then shuffled between prisons. The constant disorientation, the lack of control, was a calculated form of psychological torture.
I can only imagine the feeling of utter helplessness, of being completely at the mercy of a system that seemed determined to break him.
Exactly. And they didn't stop there. Ray described being strapped into straitjackets, hosed down with cold water, and left for hours in solitary confinement. The sensory deprivation, the sleep deprivation, the deliberately disgusting food, it was all part of the systematic effort to strip him of his sense of self.
Solitary confinement is considered cruel and unusual punishment these days, and rightfully so. The psychological toll it takes is well documented.
You can only imagine what that kind of prolonged isolation, compounded by the physical abuse, did to Ray.
Where did this brutal treatment ultimately land him?
He ended up in the segregation unit at Winchester Prison, a place he would later describe as the most harrowing experience of his entire sentence.
Winchester, what was it about that specific prison that made it so horrific?
The segregation unit was designed for sensory deprivation and focused abuse. Picture a cell stripped bare, just a concrete bed and a heavy, padded mattress. And that mattress wasn't for comfort.
Oh, God. Don't tell me they.
They did. The guards would use that mattress to beat him, sometimes multiple times a day. It was a way to inflict maximum pain while minimizing visible injuries.
It makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. This wasn't discipline. It was calculated torture. Did no one intervene? Did anyone try to help it?
It seems his saving grace, ironically, was his mother. When she couldn't get information from the prison system about Ray's whereabouts or condition, she started raising hell. She contacted everyone she could think of, demanding answers, demanding to know what they were doing to her son.
It's amazing how often it takes someone on the outside, someone tirelessly fighting for justice, to make the system even acknowledge basic human rights.
It's both tragic and inspiring. And in Ray's case, it seems his mother's tenacity may have saved his life. The authorities eventually transferred him out of Winchester to Chelmsford Prison.
Okay, so a change of scenery. Was Chelmsford any better than Winchester?
It was a different world compared to the horrors of Winchester. Don't get me wrong, Chelmsford was still a high-security facility, but it offered Ray a sliver of respite, a chance to catch his breath and reclaim some semblance of normalcy.
What was different about it? How did the environment, the atmosphere compare?
Ray talks about Chelmsford having a slightly more relaxed atmosphere. He could engage in activities like weightlifting and had more opportunities to interact with other inmates, forming genuine connections. Some for better, some for worse. It was also at Chelmsford where he crossed paths with a fascinating cast of characters.
Oh, like who?
He met Jimmy Tibbs, the famed boxing trainer. There was Ronnie Bender, a bank robber who spent his days in deep meditation, practicing something called astral projection.
Astral projection. Now that's a new one for me.
It's a practice that aims to project your consciousness outside of your physical body. I guess when you're stuck in prison, exploring other realms holds a certain appeal.
I can see how that would be appealing in that situation. Who else did he encounter?
Oh, and we can't forget Tony Lawrence, an enforcer for the notorious Richardson gang.
It's incredible the characters he kept crossing paths with, like a real-life lockup documentary.
That's an apt comparison. But it wasn't all doom and gloom at Chelmsford. Ray had a knack for finding himself in the middle of the most bizarre situations.
Like what?
He tells this story about a group of inmates who somehow managed to sneak a cow into the prison.
A cow? You can't be serious. What did they do with a cow in prison?
Honestly, the logistics of getting a cow past prison security are beyond me. But it just goes to show the lengths people would go to for a taste of the outside world. Or maybe just a good laugh. He also witnessed the Sex Pistols performing a concert for the prisoners.
Wow. A punk rock concert in a high-security prison. That must have been a sight to see.
Right. These anecdotes, while seemingly random, paint a picture of prison life in all its absurdity.
It's like a bizarre social experiment. You put all these people from different walks of life with different stories and motivations into this pressure cooker environment, and these strange, unexpected things happen.
Exactly. But even in the relative calm of Chelmsford, violence was never far away. Ray tells a chilling story about a fellow inmate, George Wilkinson, a notorious hostage taker.
Okay, hostage taker. That sounds ominous. What happened?
Wilkinson had a reputation for being unpredictable, fueled in part by the heavy medications he was on for both physical and mental ailments. Ray, because of his size and reputation, was tasked with keeping an eye on Wilkinson, making sure he didn't cause any trouble. But things took a dark turn one day in the prison TV room.
What happened?
Wilkinson, in a drug-induced state, lashed out, creating a chaotic scene that quickly escalated into a violent confrontation with the guards.
So much for Chelmsford being a break from the constant threat of violence. It sounds like that was just an illusion.
It highlights that even in those moments of relative peace, that underlying tension, that potential for chaos, never truly went away.
So what happened to Ray after Chelmsford?
He was transferred again, this time to Jonesworth Prison.
Another prison, another chapter in his story. What was Jonesworth like?
Well, according to Ray, Jonesworth offered a more relaxed environment compared to the others. He talks about having the opportunity to play rugby, pursue hobbies, and experience a degree of freedom within the prison walls that he hadn't encountered elsewhere.
It's remarkable how each prison had its own distinct character, its own rhythm, its own set of rules.
It's true. And navigating those nuances was as crucial to survival as understanding the prison system itself. And even amidst the harsher realities, those moments of humor, of camaraderie, persisted.
Oh, what kind of moments?
He tells this hilarious story about playing a prank on a fellow inmate by putting cow manure in his water bucket.
Cow manure! I'm simultaneously disgusted and impressed. Where on earth did he even find cow manure in prison?
We may never know. But it speaks to that dark humor, that ability to find light in the darkest of places. That defined his spirit.
It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, I suppose, finding reasons to laugh even when surrounded by such bleak circumstances.
Exactly. But just when it seems like Ray might find a semblance of peace, even within the confines of Jonesworth, disaster struck.
What kind of disaster?
A fire broke out, engulfing Jonesworth in a terrifying inferno.
A prison fire. That's everyone's worst nightmare.
Absolutely. Ray described it as absolute chaos. Smoke billowing through the cell blocks, alarms blaring, inmates scrambling for safety as the fire raged. It's a stark reminder of the ever-present danger, the fragility of life within those walls.
The chaos, the fear, the uncertainty. It's hard to even fathom what that must have been like.
It was a stark reminder that no matter how relaxed a prison might seem, it could descend into chaos in an instant.
So what happened in the aftermath of the fire? Where did they send Ray?
After the fire, he was transferred yet again. And in a twist of fate, he found himself back where it all began. Wormwood Scrubs.
Wormwood Scrubs. Back to square one.
It was a full-circle moment that underscored the cyclical nature of his journey. But this time, something was different. Years had passed. He had endured unimaginable hardships, witnessed unspeakable acts, and somehow managed to retain some semblance of hope. And it was at Wormwood Scrubs, after all those years, that Ray finally got his release.
1979, right? It was the dawn of a new decade, and Ray Hill, once a troubled youth caught in the relentless churn of the justice system, was finally stepping back into the world. Did he express any feelings about being released? Relief. Fear.
Well, just before the interview ends, Ray utters a rather chilling statement. He says, "My street fighting started when I came out."
Street fighting. That's ominous. It's like after all he'd endured, all those attempts to break him, to rehabilitate him, he was right back where he started. Or maybe, as he suggests, it was only the beginning.
That's the question that lingers, isn't it? Did prison change him, rehabilitate him? Or did it simply forge a more hardened version of the young man who first walked through those gates all those years ago?
It really does make you wonder, was prison just a holding pen for him, just waiting for him to become, well, a more hardened criminal ready for life outside?
Yeah, it's the question, isn't it? And there's no easy answers with Ray's story. Here's what we know. His story, it doesn't end with him just quietly fading away after release. He walks out of Wormwood Scrubs. And boom, right back into the thick of it.
Wow.
Only this time. Well, he's older now. He's seen more, done more, battle-hardened after years in the brutal reality of the British prison system.
So what about his life after prison? Does he fall back into old habits or try to make a fresh start?
That's where the second part of Ray's story kicks off.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, it's a wild ride. He comes out of prison with a network, right? Some contacts, some legit, some, well, let's say deep in the criminal world. And as you can imagine,
Oh, I can only imagine.
things get messy.
I bet they do. Knowing Ray, I can only imagine the situations he found himself in. I gotta ask, without spoiling anything, is there any hope in this second part? Or is it just as dark and gritty as the first?
Well, I don't want to ruin the ending for you, but let's just say, Ray's life, it never strays too far from the shadows. It's a world where good and bad, they get kind of blurry. Loyalty, it's like a currency, constantly changing value, and violence,
Yeah.
always bubbling under the surface.
That's intense. I can't wait to dig into that next chapter. But for now, before we wrap up this deep dive into Ray Hill's life, his time in the British prison system, is there one last thought? A question, maybe? Something you want to leave our listeners with as they think about this incredible story?
Ray's story, it reminds us that sometimes there's a really fine line between being the victim and becoming the perpetrator. Makes you think, how much of who we are is because of what happens to us? And how much is just, our own choices? Can someone who's lived with so much violence, both on the receiving end and dishing it out, ever really change? Ever find redemption? Tough questions, no easy answers. But they're the questions we got to ask ourselves, especially when we think about the justice system, right?
Hmm.
And that blurry line between justice and revenge.
Man, it's given me a lot to think about. Ray's story, it stays with you. A real reminder of the human cost of crime, of punishment, and just how strong the human spirit can be, even facing things you can't even imagine.